In this video, I want to talk about the bones that make up the cervical region of the vertebral column. Cervical region is a little bit different than the other regions. All cervical vertebra, every one of them, see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, have a feature in their transverse process known as the transverse foramen. So here we see an example of a typical cervical vertebra with its body, and in the transverse process we can see an opening called the transverse foramen. That is found in every cervical vertebra. Now on cervical vertebra it's a little harder to make out what is called the pedicle and the transverse process. We can see the lamina and we can see the spinous process. Now the spinous process in cervical vertebra is not very long and it is usually bifid. That means it divides into two little points. This one you can kind of see the bifurcation, but it has been chipped away. The opening in the middle of this vertebra is known as the vertebral foramen. Remember, the opening between adjacent vertebra was an intervertebral foramen. The opening in the middle of an individual vertebra is known as the vertebral foramen. So I can tell at a quick glance that this must be a cervical vertebra because it has the transverse foramen. However, we need to look at cervical vertebra just a little bit more closely, so I'm going to switch this typical cervical vertebra out for another vertebra which is known as the atlas. The atlas. Here we see the atlas in a superior and inferior view. If we look at the atlas, we can see that it does not have a body, but it has what is called an anterior arch and a posterior arch. Anterior and posterior arch, and we can see a very large vertebral foramen, and we can see, if we tilt it just right, we can see the transverse foramen. Let me flip this atlas over, and again we can see here the transverse foramen in the atlas. Notice the atlas, no body, posterior arch, anterior arch, so no spinous processes. The atlas is the bone that the occipital bone of the skull rests on to form the atlanto-occipital joint. Very important that we realize there's no body. The only motion possible between the skull and the atlas is a flexion extension at the atlanto-occipital joint. Now if we compare that bone, that is also C1, the first cervical vertebra, or the atlas. We compare that to the second cervical vertebra. This is known as the atlas. From a superior view, you maybe can't tell, so I'm going to tilt this. The atlas has a feature sticking up out of the body. So here's the body of the atlas. It has a tooth-like structure sticking up out of the top. That is known as the dens, or the odontoid process. Embryologically, that was the body of our first cervical vertebra. It fused to the top of the second cervical vertebra, also known as the axis, to make a pivot point, or an axle, for which the first cervical vertebra can pivot. So I'm going to lower this back down. We're looking at a superior view. Now from this view it's very hard to see, but there is a transverse foramen tucked up underneath. I'll flip it over in a second. But I want to put the atlas back on, and we can see how this fits, and this will make a pivot point. So the motion between our atlas and our axis is a rotational movement. It is a rotational movement. So between the atlas and the axis, we have rotation. Between the atlas and the occipital bone of the skull, we have flexion and extension. Again, the protrusion out of the top of the body of the axis is known as the dens, or the odontoid process. Now if I invert this, you can see from an inferior view the transverse foramen. So if you pick this up in the lab exam, look for that transverse foramen, you know that it has to be a cervical vertebra. Because it has the dens, or the odontoid process, it must be the second cervical vertebra. The last cervical vertebra that I want to talk about is known as, well, this is the vertebra prominens. But how can I tell? Well, first, I know that this is a cervical vertebra because I can see the transverse foramen. I can also see the vertebral foramen. The seventh cervical vertebra, also known as the vertebra prominens, has a very long spinous process that does not have a bifurcation at the tip. So I know that this would be 7th cervical vertebra. So if I see it on a lab exam, the first thing I do is I look for the transverse foramen. If it has them, it is a cervical vertebra. If it does not have a body, it would have been C1, the atlas. It does have a body, so it's not C1. Does it have an odontoid process or a dens? It does not, so it cannot be C2. That means it has to be 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. Because it does not bifurcate and it has a long spinous process, that tells me this would be C7. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are more like this, a shorter spinous process with a bifurcation. So that covers what you should need to know about the cervical vertebra.